Operation Mirror Concept, How the U.S. Fooled Its Own Satellite, complete script. The seventh flag on the world map was for Alexei. Miles Turner stared at the small, stark pin in Madrid. Alexei Petrov. Compromised. Exfiltration failed. Status: terminated. The file on his desk felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Paper-clipped to the front was a photograph of a man with a kind, tired smile, a man Turner had recruited in a dusty bar a lifetime ago. Now he was a ghost, and Turner's office was a gallery for ghosts. The air in the CIA's counterintelligence center was thick and cold, heavy with a fear that had no sound. It was the fear of a locked room filling slowly with poison gas. Case officers, the agency's best and bravest, were being erased. Not just caught, not just killed, erased. Their networks vanished. Their safe houses were empty, their bodies turned up in ditches, with a finality that spoke of perfect, intimate knowledge. Each red line drawn through a file was a small, quiet murder inside the walls of Langley itself. For weeks, Turner had lived in this tomb, surrounded by the photographs of the lost. He was a connoisseur of patterns, a man who believed that all chaos hid an order. He had to find it. He cross-referenced everything: dates, locations, methods. And then, in a moment of cold, sickening clarity, he looked at the one thing he had been avoiding: the internal checkout logs, the records of who had accessed these doomed agents' files. His heart stopped. His breath froze in his lungs. There it was. The pattern was not in the field reports. It was in the bureaucracy. A single, neat bureaucratic signature. It was on Alexei's file. It was on the woman in Beirut's file. It was on the general in Warsaw's file. Every single one of the 7 lost agents had their existence signed away by the same man, in the 30 days before they were wiped from the board. Aldrich Ames, the chief of the Soviet branch. The man paid to be their shield. He was the source of the poison. The heresy of the thought was so immense it felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Accusing a brother in counterintelligence was the ultimate sin. It was career suicide. But the data was no longer data. It was a scream. It was Alexei's smile, staring at him from a photograph, demanding an answer. He didn't walk to the deputy director's office. He marched. He was a man possessed. He threw the logs onto the polished wood desk, his finger slamming down on Ames's name again and again, a frantic, furious drumbeat of betrayal. Deputy Director Webster looked from the logs to Turner's face. The exhaustion in his eyes melted away, replaced by a dawning, bottomless horror. He saw it too. The enemy wasn't in Moscow. He was down the hall drinking their coffee, sharing their jokes, and signing their death warrants. "We bring him in," Webster said, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. "We bring him in right now." No. Turner's voice was flat, cold, absolute. The word hung in the air, a declaration of war. He saw Alexei's face. He saw all their faces. "We don't bring him in. We use him." He leaned over the desk, his eyes burning. "He is a pipeline. We know where it leads. So we control what flows through it. We will build a world for him. A beautiful, perfect, fictional world. We will feed him lies so exquisite, he will think they are truths. We will turn his treason into our weapon. We will make him our loudspeaker into the heart of the KGB." Webster stared, his mind reeling at the audacity, the moral void of the plan. It was monstrous. It was a descent into the same darkness they fought. It meant looking at a traitor who had killed their friends and smiling at him. It meant sacrificing the truth on the altar of vengeance. A long, terrible silence filled the room. Finally, Webster gave a single grim nod. It was not approval. It was a sentence. Do it. Turner walked back to his office. He stopped before the world map. He looked at the 7 flags, at the photograph of Alexei. The hunt was over. A much more dangerous game was beginning. He was no longer just a hunter. He was an architect of the perfect, most devastating lie the CIA had ever told. And the foundation of that lie would be the body of a friend. The factory was born in a vault deep beneath Langley, a sterile, soundproofed chamber where reality was taken apart and put back together as fiction. It was a prison for the truth, and Miles Turner was its warden. His small, hand-picked team operated in a state of perpetual twilight, their world reduced to the glow of monitors and the scent of cold coffee. Their mission was alchemy, to transform leaden lies into golden intelligence. They created phantom assets with elaborate backstories, fictional military deployments with convincing logistics trails, and fake technological breakthroughs documented in perfect forgeries. Every document was a work of art, designed to withstand the KGB's most brutal scrutiny. They were writing a novel where Aldrich Ames was the protagonist, and every chapter he read was a carefully crafted deception. But Turner's masterstroke was more insidious. He called it the Ghost Protocol. He identified a handful of agents who had already been betrayed by Ames but, for some mysterious reason, had not been acted upon by the KGB. These men and women were living on borrowed time, their fates a question mark. Turner's team fabricated critical intelligence specifically for these agents, false information about their loyalty, fabricated evidence of their own double-dealing with the CIA, and fed it to Ames. The logic was a knife's-edge gamble. If the KGB, upon receiving this urgent information from their prized mole, suddenly moved against these agents, it would prove they had been holding them in reserve. They were assets so valuable or so deeply buried that the Soviets were protecting them even from their own mole's initial purge. By lighting a fire under them with a fabricated crisis, Turner was forcing the KGB's hand, using Ames to reveal a second, hidden layer of infiltration. Watching Ames was its own special kind of torture. The man moved through the halls of Langley with a swagger that turned Turner's stomach. He saw Ames laughing at the water cooler, the man's expensive new watch glinting under the fluorescent lights, a watch paid for with blood money, with Alexei's blood. Every casual interaction was a performance. Turner had to smile, to nod, to ask about his weekend, all while knowing he was talking to a murderer who held the detonator to their entire operation. One morning, Turner watched from his office as Ames dropped a file onto his secretary's desk. It was a routine gesture, but Turner's blood ran cold. The file was flagged for a deep-cover agent in East Berlin, a man Turner had personally marked for the Ghost Protocol. Ames was handling the bait. For a terrifying second, Turner's resolve wavered. He was about to sign this man's death warrant. He was not just observing, he was pulling the trigger. He saw the face of the East Berlin agent, a man with a family, a man who believed he was safe. He was sacrificing a pawn to save the king, and the chessboard was made of human lives. He looked at the photograph of Alexei on his desk. The kind, tired eyes seemed to be watching him, waiting. Turner picked up a secure phone and dialed the factory. His voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside. "The package is in transit," he said, using the prearranged code. "The ghost is active." He hung up. The die was cast. In East Berlin, An innocent man was now the star of a fictional drama he knew nothing about, his life hanging on whether the KGB believed the lie that was, at this very moment, being delivered into their hands by their most trusted American asset. The Hall of Mirrors was complete, and the first reflection was about to be tested. Turner sat in the silence, no longer just an architect of lies, but an executioner waiting for a signal from the grave. The wait was an exquisite form of torture. Days bled into a week. The factory operated in a state of suspended animation, the air thick with a silent, screaming question. Turner watched the traffic, the real, honest traffic from their remaining assets, for any ripple, any tremor that would signal the KGB had taken the bait. Every silent hour felt like a failure. Every secure line that didn't ring was a verdict of innocence for the East Berlin agent, and a death sentence for Turner's entire theory. He watched Ames, who seemed to grow more confident, more insufferable, with each passing day. The lie was sustaining him, feeding his ego, making him feel invincible. Turner had to sit in meetings with him, listening to the man opine on Soviet strategy, all while knowing he was a puppet whose strings led directly to this soundproofed room. The cognitive dissonance was a constant low-grade hum in Turner's skull. Then, on the 8th day, the signal came. It wasn't a dramatic cable or a frantic call. It was a single line of text in a routine morning intelligence digest from a signals intelligence post in West Berlin. The header was bland. Infrastructure disruption. The body was a single devastating sentence. Unconfirmed reports of a domestic gas explosion at an apartment in Prenzlauer Berg. East German authorities have cordoned off the entire block. No casualties reported. The address was the Ghosts. The East Berlin agent, the man with a family. Turner read the line again. And again. His hands were perfectly steady, but his heart was a trip hammer against his ribs. There was no gas explosion. There were no unconfirmed reports. This was the KGB's signature. A quiet professional disappearance. A story woven to explain the sudden void where a man used to be. He had done it. He had proven his theory. The Ghost Protocol was a success. The agent in East Berlin had been a protected asset. A sleeper so valuable the KGB had ignored Ames's initial betrayal. But Turner's fabricated crisis, the lie about the agent's supposed double dealings, had been too urgent, too dangerous to ignore. They had been forced to burn their own precious asset to contain a threat that never existed. He stood up from his desk and walked to the world map in the factory. His team watched him, their faces a mixture of awe and horror. They understood the significance of the message. They had won. With a hand that betrayed no emotion, Turner picked up a black marker. He didn't look at the photograph of the East Berlin agent he kept in a locked drawer. He couldn't. He drew a thick black line through the pin in East Berlin. Then next to it, he placed a new pin. A blue one. His invention. The pin did not mark a person. It marked a presence. It represented a confirmed, previously unknown Soviet spy, whose existence was now proven by the corpse of the man they had just sacrificed. The room was utterly silent. There was no celebration, no triumph, only the heavy, chilling understanding of what their victory cost. They had traded a life for a data point. They had used a man as a canary in a coal mine, and the canary was dead. Turner turned to his team, his face a mask of grim purpose. The marker felt heavy in his hand. "The protocol is validated," he said, his voice echoing flatly in the sterile room. We have confirmed an unknown hostile presence, a ghost. Now we find its name." He looked at the board, at the single blue pin. It was no longer just a theory. The mirror had reflected something back, a shadow. And where there was one shadow, there were always more. The hunt for the second wave had begun, and its first trophy was a man they had sentenced to die. The blue pins multiplied. The factory became a gallery of ghosts they had created. Each pin was a tombstone for an agent sacrificed, and a headstone for a Soviet spy uncovered. Turner's map was a grim harvest, the black lines of the fallen crosshatched with the blue pins of the identified. The cost was astronomical, but the intelligence was priceless. They were dismantling a network the CIA never knew existed. But the sheer success of the operation began to breed its own danger. Ames, the unwitting catalyst of this purge, was growing restless. The flood of intelligence he was providing was so prolific, so devastatingly accurate in its results, that it was burnishing his reputation to a brilliant sheen. He was being hailed as the most effective officer in a generation. This success intoxicated him, but it also made him bold, reckless. He began to ask questions, dangerous questions. He cornered Turner outside the secure vault, his breath smelling of mint and expensive whiskey, a false camaraderie in his eyes. "Miles, these breakthroughs, they're incredible," Ames said, his voice a low, conspiratorial rumble. "But the sourcing, some of these assets you're having me run, I've never heard of them. Their files are thin. It's almost too good. Where's it all coming from?" Turner's blood turned to ice. The puppet was tugging on its strings. He forced a casual smile, the most difficult performance of his life. "New protocols, Aldrich. Compartmentalized. You know how it is. We're just the postman. Don't question the miracle." Ames held his gaze for a moment too long, a flicker of something calculating in his eyes. He didn't believe him. The lie was becoming too perfect, too sterile. A man of Ames's ego and paranoia needed to feel the grit of reality, and the factory produced only polished fiction. The crisis erupted hours later. An alert flashed on Turner's secure terminal. A fabricated asset, a phantom they had created named Kestrel, was being run by Ames through a back-channel verification. He was using a non-KGB contact, a retired Stasi officer he kept in his pocket for personal validations. He was testing the merchandise. Panic, cold, and absolute seized the factory. If that query received an answer, the entire house of cards would collapse. Ames would know he was being played. He would go to ground, warn the KGB, and every blue pin on their map would vanish, their sacrifice rendered meaningless. There was no time for committees, for deliberation. This was a wound that needed cauterizing now. Turner made a decision that would haunt him forever. He gave a single, brutal order to his tech team. "Burn Kestrel. Burn him now." The techs worked in a frantic, silent ballet. They activated a pre-programmed contingency, a catastrophic compromise scenario. They flooded the channels with ghost traffic, fake distress signals from Kestrel, warnings of a looming counterintelligence sweep. They made it look like the fictional Kestrel was not just compromised, but that his exposure was imminent and would threaten the entire network. Minutes later, Turner watched from his office as Ames received a panicked, encrypted message. He saw the color drain from the man's face. Ames read the warning, his arrogance replaced by raw fear. He immediately aborted his verification request. The threat to his own safety, manufactured by Turner's team, was more real to him than his own suspicions. The immediate danger had passed. The operation was saved, But the cost was a new, deeper layer of damnation. To protect their lie, they had to make it more real, more dangerous, even to its architect. They had to simulate a fire so convincing that the arsonist himself would flee the flames. Turner looked at the photograph of Alexei, then at the board of blue pins. He was no longer just sacrificing real agents to uncover real spies. He was now sacrificing his own lies to protect other lies. He was trapped in an infinite regression of deception, each layer more morally bankrupt than the last. Ames was no longer just a pawn. He had become a hostile, sentient element within their own lab. And the only way to control him was to make the fictional world they had built for him so terrifying that he dared not question it. The game was no longer about outsmarting the KGB. It was about terrorizing their own mole into obedience. The end began not with a bang, but with a quiet, bureaucratic transfer. The FBI took over. Operation Mirror Concept was officially concluded. Miles Turner handed over a master list, a roll call of the damned and the saved. On it were the names of every agent lost to Ames's initial betrayal, and next to them the identities of the second-wave spies, the blue pin assets, whose existence had been purchased with that blood money. He was not in the room when they arrested Aldrich Ames. He didn't need to be. He had already conducted the real interrogation for months, inside the man's own mind. He watched the news footage on a small television in the factory. Ames, looking confused and paunchy in a cheap windbreaker, being led away. There was no victory in that image. Only a messy, public cleanup of an operation that had been clinically precise in its private execution. Weeks later, in a sterile debriefing room, Turner was handed a final report. It was stamped success. The deputy director shook his hand, called him a patriot, a genius. The blue pins had been an intelligence coup of historic proportions. They had saved countless future operations. They had gutted a deep cover network it would have taken the KGB decades to rebuild. Turner walked out of Langley for the last time, the accolades ringing hollow in his ears. He went home to a quiet house. The war was over. But the silence there was different from the silence of the factory. It was a vacuum, filled with the ghosts he had created. He tried to return to a normal life, but his mind was a haunted palace. He would be grilling in his backyard and see the face of the East Berlin agent, the first ghost, and remember the gas explosion that never was. He would be watching a movie and flinch at a scene of a celebration, remembering the expensive watch on Ames's wrist, a watch that gleamed while men were dying in ditches. One afternoon he received a sealed envelope, no return address. Inside was a single typewritten line on a blank sheet of paper. The mirror reflects both ways. It was not a threat. It was a verdict, his own. He realized then that he had not been playing a game of chess. He had been standing between two opposing mirrors, and the reflections had stretched into an infinite corridor of lies. He had stared into the abyss of the KGB, and to fight it, he had built an abyss of his own inside the CIA. And in the end, he could no longer tell the difference. He had won. He had saved his country. He had outsmarted everyone. He sat in his living room as the sun set, the room darkening around him. The greatest secret of Operation Mirror Concept was not the list of spies he had uncovered. It was the cost. The cost was the man he had been, the man who believed in truth, the man who had recruited Alexei Petrov in a dusty Madrid bar. That man was gone, erased as thoroughly as any of the agents on the board. He had sacrificed himself on the same altar. He was a hero, a savior, a ghost. And as he sat in the deepening twilight, he knew, with a certainty that was colder than any truth, that the ghost was the only thing that remained.